According to a recent Gallup poll, the number of people who find polygamy morally acceptable in America has gone from 7% to 20+% in the last 20 years. As you can see on the screen behind me, that means we have jumped drastically, more than double what it would have just been back in the even in the 90s and 2000s. Things are changing. And you might wonder, what kind of people are finding this acceptable? Is it really right-wing, conservative individuals? Well, the Gallup poll indicated that it's actually, more often than not, younger people who are non-religious, who, surprise here, unmarried, and also who are politically liberal. And so when you look at the demographics of the types of people who are saying we should add this in, it fits with the agenda that we heard about this morning, that we hear about all around us in various other venues. If this would be acceptable for marriage, why not this as well? Why not multiple marriages? So when you look at religious individuals, and particularly when you look among Jews and Christians, they are less likely to be supporters of polygamy. And yet there are those who question. They say, but what about the polygamy that we see in the Bible, where we see men of faith who have multiple wives? How do we reconcile this? Has something changed now that we've come to the New Testament? Is it that God has just kept this going and it's because of our culture and the West that we have adopted monogamy, but God never demanded that we adopt monogamy? Well, we're going to talk through that this evening. We're going to think about the question, does God approve of polygamy? And we're actually going to use Genesis as a test case to answer this question. Which one? Monogamy or polygamy, or are both acceptable before God? You might be thinking, well, why is this really relevant? You might say, well, I saw the graphic. I know that there are 20+%, but I don't run into those kinds of people. I don't run into polygamists or those who say that polygamy is okay. Why would we want to do this kind of a study? Well, number one, I think it is important because this fits with something we do need to have a good handle on, is what is the divine pattern for marriage? But another added benefit to doing a study like this is that it helps us to understand how to read the Bible. As we look at those stories of polygamy, God intends for us to read narrative in order to read the stories of the Old Testament in such a way that it will help, and the New Testament for that matter, in such a way that we can come to understand what is the moral of the story. And I'm going to kind of nuance what I mean by moral of the story as we work our way through, but God does intend to teach lessons by the stories that we read. This is, as we've been talking about in our adult class, and that's a third reason why a study like this is important, as we've been looking at Genesis, looking at the Pentateuch, and we see these things, the question has been risen, and so we need to come to this question, say, what does the Bible say? And when it says something about polygamy, and I might think that is approving of it, I need to take the broader context. So I want us to see, how do we read Genesis and its polygamy? How does God want us to read Genesis and polygamy? And how does this fit into the broader context of the entire Bible? And I think by the end of this study, and I'll just go ahead and tip my hand, God has always intended monogamy. Polygamy is always a step away from what God intended, and Jesus has brought us back to the original pattern of monogamy. As we begin, I do want to make sure that I am clear in the terms that I am using. Some of you, especially some of our younger crowd, might be thinking, what does the word monogamy or polygamy mean? Now, I don't mean to be demeaning at all in raising even the question of definition, but I know that even some of my kids were like, what does that word mean? And so I want to be clear what we mean by monogamy, what we mean by polygamy. And this really is just an English word that is borrowed from the Greek language that basically means either one marriage or many marriages. So monogamy is one marriage, polygamy is many marriages. And as we read through Genesis, we do find that several individuals are involved in monogamous marriages. That is a marriage between one man and one woman. So let's take a quick trek through the book of Genesis and see what it says about these monogamous marriages. And let's start at the very beginning with Adam. If you would open your Bibles to Genesis chapter 2. Genesis chapter 2. And we're going to read a slightly longer section here, Genesis 2, verses 18 through 25. But I want us to see what God does in instituting marriage. It says in verse 18, "Then the Lord God said, 'It is not good for the man to be alone. I will make a helper suitable for him.' Out of the ground the Lord God formed every beast of the field and every bird of the sky and brought them to the man to see what he would call them. And whatever the man called a living creature, that was its name. The man gave names to all the cattle and to the birds of the sky and to every beast of the field. But for Adam there was not found a helper suitable for him. So the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon the man, and he slept. Then he took one of his ribs and closed up the flesh in that place. The Lord God fashioned into a woman the rib which he had taken from the man, and brought her to the man. The man said, 'This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and his mother, and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh.' And the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed." Now, if you have a marker, you might want to place it here. We're going to come back in a couple of points and take a look at that passage there in verse 24. But as you just look at the story, this is related to us in narrative, and it is not just so that we know what happened at the beginning. It is to teach a lesson. In fact, verse 24 indicates that this story is included so that the Israelites, so that we would know this is what God wanted. He gave one man, one woman, and then said, "Therefore, for this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife." The singular there is significant, isn't it? There's a man and there is a woman. God intended for one man and one woman to be the start of humanity. And from that, we see that the marriage occurs and they fulfill the command that was given back in chapter 1. In fact, open to chapter 1 and verse 26. We read this morning, but I want to look at a slightly different aspect of this text. Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. "Then God said, 'Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth.' God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, 'Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over every living thing that moves on the earth.'" Now, if you look there at verse 28, if we were to say that polygamy is just a matter of what is practical, what is pragmatic, then it would make sense that if God said, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth," it seems like it'd be much more practical to have many wives who can have many children and fill the earth that much quicker. That's not what God does at creation. He gives one man, one woman, Adam and Eve. We'll come back to this idea just a little bit more. The next person or persons that we come to in the book of Genesis that are married to only one woman is Noah and then his three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. If you have your Bible open, look at Genesis chapter 6. Genesis chapter 6. I just want to remind you as we read through this, for the most part, we're just reading the stories. It is not like we have legal code here that God is saying it is to be one man, one woman for life. But he is revealing certain principles that he wants people to understand. So here we come to the flood narrative. And if you look at chapter 6 and verse 18, Genesis chapter 6 and verse number 18, it says, "But I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall enter the ark, you and your sons and your wife and your sons' wives with you." Now, if we were just to read that, we might say, it seems a little bit ambiguous. We don't know how many wives the sons had. Well, let's just keep on reading. Look down in chapter 7 and verse number 7. "Then Noah and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives with him entered the ark because of the water of the flood." So they do exactly what God had commanded them to do. Drop down to verse number 13. "On the very same day, Noah and Shem and Ham and Japheth, the sons of Noah, and Noah's wife and the 3 wives of his sons with him entered the ark. How many wives do his 3 sons have? There are 3. 1, 2, 3. And notice that we can't even stretch that to say that this is talking about, well, maybe they had 3 each or something along those lines. That's not the way the text reads. But if someone tried to stretch it, if we believe the entire Bible, when we get to 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 20, what's it say? 8 souls were saved by water, through water. What's that mean? Noah, Shem, Ham, Japheth. How are we going to come up with each of them having wives and come up to the number 8? That means we have to have 4. That means they each had to have 1 wife. Now here's the interesting thing. God is again going to make the same command that give the same command that he did to Adam and Eve after the flood. Be fruitful and multiply. If this was a matter of pragmatics, seems like you would gather some other wives and bring them on board so that you can have ease of multiplying after the flood, but they don't do that. Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth each have their own wife. They bring them on the ark, and there they fulfill God's expectation. Now, something I do find significant is that we find these monogamous individuals. How has God already described Noah? He is a righteous man. He is blameless. He receives favor from the Lord. That seems to indicate that we are to read this story as Noah is someone to look up to. And when Noah is involved in marriage, what kind of a marriage is it? It is monogamous. All right? Now, we'll come back to this idea, but just hold that in your mind. Now, here's another one I want to bring up that is also in the flood story that is not a person as an example, but is actually the animals as well. Now, we know that when we look around in nature, I don't know the exact number of species that are monogamous. Sometimes you hear about that. Actually, we have a story about that is in our family that my sister came and visited while we were living in Montgomery. We went to a zoo, and she saw the caperberry, I think that's what it's called. And it says on the sign, they are monogamous, that they mate for life. And she goes, they're Christians. And so we always think about caperberries as being the Christian species. But we have this picture of animals. And not all of them are monogamous in nature. But what do we find when God says, I want you to save the animals? Let's read. Look with me in chapter 7 and verses 2 and 3. You shall take with you of every clean animal by sevens, a male and his female, and of the animals that are not clean too, a male and his female, also of the birds of the sky by sevens, male and female, to keep offspring alive on the face of all the earth. So even with the animals, what does God want? A male and his female. And again, the animals are also going to go forth, and they are going to populate, go to multiply on the earth. How does God provide for that? A male and his female. It seems like here at the beginning of the story of Genesis, we're seeing kind of this push toward God started it this way. A righteous man is involved in monogamy, and even when God makes provision for the saving of the animals, a male and his female. Now, the next person that we come to who is monogamous in the book of Genesis is Lot. And Lot is kind of a difficult person to really tack down, because Peter does tell us that he was righteous and that he was tormented by what was happening around him. And yet there are elements of the story that you look at this and you say, he made some very poor decisions in his life. But what I do note is that when we get to the marriage of Lot, and it actually takes a little while before you get to it, you seem to have an indication of some kind of family, though it could be before this, though it could be talking about some other captives in chapter 14 when Abraham comes and he delivers Lot, talks about women and children. But when we first really find out some specific information about the marriages of Lot, it is that he has a wife. And then his daughters are going to be, who are betrothed to men of that city as well. But again, it is his wife. She is brought along with, and we are to remember Lot's wife, not because of the monogamous marriage, but because of a very poor, evil choice that she made. But here we have someone who is monogamous. Now, the reason I bring up Lot is not because he's in a kind of morally ambiguous scenario here, but a kind of historical background idea that I want to raise to the surface. In the ancient Near East, as you look at the writings outside the Bible, just about the only people who were capable of having a harem or having multiple wives were wealthy men. Now, what do we know about Lot? Lot is a wealthy man, and he has one wife. If anyone would have had the resources for it, if it's not just a matter of pragmatics for obeying the command to fill the earth, but also do you have the resources to supply this entire family, Lot has the resources, and he has a wife. We're going to come back to that same historical idea in just a moment. Now, I would note that the end of the story with Lot, his daughters get him drunk and they have relations with him, but this is not necessarily a marriage scenario, and so we're not going to include that in either monogamy or polygamy there. So the next person we would come to would be that of Isaac. And we're not going to read all of Isaac's story, but I would just note that the marriage of Isaac and Rebekah, there's an entire chapter dedicated to Abraham sending a servant to find him a wife. And that wife is brought back to Isaac, and they are married, and they stay married, and Isaac doesn't add any other wives to this relationship. In fact, even though Rebekah is barren for 20 years, he does not add any other wife. He prays to God. God opens the womb of Rebekah, and they have their twin sons. So Isaac is another example of monogamy. Then finally, we come to Joseph. If you would look in Genesis chapter 41, Genesis 41, in verse number 45, this is after he has interpreted the dream of Pharaoh. He is exalted to basically second in command. It says, then Pharaoh named Joseph Zaphanath Paneah, and he gave him Asenath, the daughter of Potipharah, priest of On, as his wife, and Joseph went forth over the land of Egypt. Notice here that actually the thing that the later Jews, the rabbis, had the most trouble with Joseph's story is that he marries an Egyptian, but that he is married to one woman seems significant. Why? The same reason with Lot. If anyone had the resources to have a harem, would it not be Joseph now that he is a nobleman? Furthermore, polygamy was common at the time of Joseph in Egypt. And so we have something that is very common in the land that he is living in. He has the resources to take care of multiple wives, and yet he has one wife, and as we read through the story, he adds no other. Again, Joseph, we might say, is kind of the premier example of faithfulness in the book of Genesis. And I think it is just something to keep in mind that the premier example of faithfulness is married to one wife and does not add any others. And so when we think about this whole story, from beginning to end in Genesis, we see that the picture of monogamy meets with God's approval. We never find in this story where someone marries a wife that God says, you know, you really should add more. He brings one wife to Adam. Then we see various faithful individuals having one wife, people like Noah and Isaac. And then at the end of the story, we see the greatest example, Joseph has one wife. When we read this story, we should at least come away saying, God approves of monogamy. Now, we do have to compare that with the other side. So what does God say about polygamy when we start reading through the story of Genesis? And we find several occasions where there are people who are involved in polygamy. And if you look at the list that's already shown up on the screen, you're going to find this kind of mixed bag of whether these are people of faith or not people of faith, but you have multiple people who get involved in polygamy in the book of Genesis. Let's just kind of survey through them. If you would, turn back to chapter 4. Chapter 4. Now, already we have seen that Adam was given a wife. We see that, and I guess I should have included that Cain also takes a wife. But then the first example of polygamy is Lamech. And if you look at chapter 4 and verse 19, it says, Lamech took for himself 2 wives. The name of the one was Adah, and the name of the other Zillah. Now, you might say, well, that seems pretty nebulous. It just says he took 2 wives. How does the story present Lamech? Let's look at verses 23 and 24. Lamech said to his wives, Adah, Zillah, listen to my voice, you wives of Lamech, give heed to my speech, for I have killed a man for wounding me, and a boy for striking me. If Cain is avenged 7-fold, then Lamech 77-fold. Does this seem like the example of faithfulness in Genesis? No, we have the first person who takes multiple wives also is a murderer. He kills someone for striking. He escalates. The revenge goes from striking to death. And so we have this picture of this is not a good man. And he is the first one to take multiple wives to himself. But the next example of polygamy is actually someone we might say, this is a good man. It is Abraham. And again, we're not going to read the entire story, but we have 3 chapters, in essence, devoted to the marriages of Abraham. Now, I want to keep some chronology in mind. Abraham marries Sarah. At whatever time he takes Sarah as his wife, Sarai as his wife, and they are married for decades, and she is barren. And over again it says she is barren. And God even starts making promises that you're going to have an heir. And we have that whole story in Genesis 15 of, how am I going to have an heir? Since you've not given me any children, and the heir is going to be a servant. How do I reconcile this? And God says, you will have a son. And so if it was a matter of you need an heir, just take another wife, that's not God who says that. That winds up being Sarah who says that. And so if we look in Genesis 16, let's read verses 1 through 4. And I'm going to tie this back to our adult class because we made a connection here in Genesis 16 to Genesis 3. It says, for Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, and she had an Egyptian maid whose name was Hagar. So Sarai said to Abram, now behold, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Please go into my maid. Perhaps I will obtain children through her. And Abraham listened to the voice of Sarai. After Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Abram's wife Sarai took Hagar the Egyptian, her maid, and gave her to her husband Abraham as his wife. He went into Hagar, and she conceived, and when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress was despised in her sight. Now, I just want to note, and I'm not going to go through all the connections again, but there are some very interesting connections, verbal connections between what Sarai is doing here and what Eve did in Genesis chapter 3 that led to the first sin, that took some of the fruit and gave it to her husband. So she and spoke. And so here we have that Sarai speaks to her husband, takes this woman and gives her to Abram. Notice it was not God who said to do this. And what we actually have are echoes of a time when man has failed in his spiritual leadership by listening to his wife who is tempting him rather than listening to what God had said. So when we have the first picture of a good man who is taking a wife for himself, it's that he is following in the same footsteps as Adam did in taking the fruit. This is not a positive picture. This is not a high point in the life of Abraham. This is actually a very low point in which he is listening to his wife and taking another wife to himself in order to produce children through her. Now, what happens after that? You wind up seeing the conflict between Sarai and Hagar. You see the conflict between Ishmael and Isaac whenever Isaac is born. You see that God eventually says, you need to do what your wife says this time by sending her away. Notice that same language of send away is the idea of you are putting her away. You're putting away Hagar, and you're sending her son with her. It's not that that God did not bless Ishmael, but he was not the son of promise. Hagar was not the wife that was going to represent something even greater. That was supposed to be Abraham and Sarai, and that was supposed to be a son of promise. And when we see Sarai trying to help God out, we see that it does not work well. The story is meant to tell us this is not good. Pragmatically, it didn't work out. It didn't fit with the established pattern that has already been set up by God. And Abraham eventually needs to send this woman away. Now, even though we don't see direct commands from God, and I'm going to come back to this idea a little bit later, it could be that Abraham actually learns a lesson from the failure that occurs there, because after he sends Hagar away, he waits until Sarah dies before he takes on another wife, Keturah. And so maybe do we see something a little bit different in Abraham as we move through the story? And in fact, look with me in Genesis 25. Genesis 25. And in verses 1 through 6, it says, Now Abraham took another wife whose name was Keturah. She bore him Zimram and Jokshan and Medan and Midian and Ishbak and Shua. Jokshan became the father of Sheba and Dedan, and the sons of Dedan were Ashurim and Luchushim and Luumim. The sons of Midian were Ephah and Epher and Hanok and Abida and Edah. All these were the sons of Keturah. Now Abraham gave all that he had to Isaac, but to the sons of his concubines Abraham gave gifts while that he was still living, and sent them away from his son Isaac eastward to the land of the east. Notice these kind of secondary wives, these concubines, he sends them away from the heir. And so even if we look at Keturah as this is a legitimate choice that Abraham made, that he takes on this wife, notice that he winds up sending these to a different place so that Isaac can be the patriarch of the family. Now, moving on from there, and we're going to come back to Abraham in just a moment. The next person we come to is Nahor. I'm not going to spend time looking at that. It's just basically very factual, gives us a little bit of the history. He has a wife, he has a concubine. Then we come to Esau. And Esau winds up marrying multiple women in chapter 26, verses 34 and 35. Genesis 26, verses 34 and 35. When Esau was 40 years old, he married Judith, the daughter of Beri, and the Hittite, and Basemath, the daughter of Elon, the Hittite, and they brought grief to Isaac and Rebekah. Now, I will note that the story does not say they were grievous because he had multiple wives. It's because they were Hittites that it was a problem for Isaac and Rebekah. But let's go to the next passage on the screen, if I have it up there. I don't. In chapter 27 and verse 46, 27:46, Rebekah said to Isaac, I am tired of living because of the daughters of Heth. If Jacob takes a wife from the daughters of Heth, like these from the daughters of the land, what good will my life be to me? And you see that they are upset because of the Hittites, because of these daughters of Heth. So what does Esau do? He adds more wives. He says, well, let me take from someone that's a little bit closer to us. Now, when you look at Esau, is this the premier picture of faithfulness in the book of Genesis? This is someone who the book of Hebrews says is a profane man. Are we starting to see a pattern as we work through the polygamous marriages? That Esau adds multiple wives, but Esau is not one that the book of Genesis says, hey, follow in his footsteps. It is meant to be a negative portrayal. What about Jacob? We have a patriarch here. What about Jacob? Well, again, we're not going to read the whole series of events in chapters 29 and 30, and even into 31, but I would look at a couple of highlights. Look with me in chapter 28, verses 1 and 2. Notice this is building right off of what we read in 27:46. Says, "So Isaac called Jacob and blessed him and charged him and said to him, 'You shall not take a wife from the daughters of Canaan. Arise, go to Paddan Aram, to the house of Bethuel, your mother's father, and from there take for yourself a wife from the daughters of Laban, your mother's brother.'" What was the original charge to Jacob? Go take a wife. Now, is Jacob trying to find as many women as he can? No, we remember the story, don't we? The one who has been the trickster now gets tricked. So now he winds up with Leah. And Laban says, "I'll give you the one you actually wanted to marry if you continue on as well." And so then we find that there's two, Leah and Rachel. And then because they start getting in conflict with one another, they say, "Here, take some concubines, our maidservants, Bilhah and Zilpah." And now he's with 4 wives. When we read the story of Jacob in Genesis, does it look like having multiple wives worked out well for his family? It is a grief to him. It leads to contention between his wives and his children. You see his wives even bartering for sexual favors with their husband so that they can have more children than the other. And you wind up seeing that it leads to a lifestyle, a family life that is in complete disarray. In fact, look at some of the stories related to his children. They've seen all this kind of rivalry and contention in Jacob and his marriages. Dinah gets involved in an illicit sexual encounter. I personally do not believe that Dinah was raped. I think it was consensual and that she was involved with someone that she should not be involved with, Shechem. But regardless, then you see what happens with Simeon and Levi, what they do in that situation. Furthermore, you see that Reuben goes into his father's concubine. And then you see Judah, who gets involved with this terrible circumstance with Tamar. Do you see how the crazy home life of Jacob's family just came to fruition with his children? Now, one could only wonder, what would it have been like if he hadn't been tricked and he just married Rachel? I would say that we can't know for sure on the hypothetical, but we definitely know what happened when he had 4 wives and had multiple children at odds with one another because of those different marriages. So again, as I read through Genesis, I have to wonder, does polygamy ever get portrayed in a positive light in the book of Genesis? And while God does not directly say polygamy is wrong in Genesis, he has associated polygamy with wicked men like Lamech and Esau, or with disappointing events or moments in the lives of righteous men like Abraham and Jacob. And what does God want us to learn? Well, he's not just saying, here's what happened. He's saying, there is something you can learn from me giving you all the details of these marriages, whether monogamous or polygamous. And so that's where I want us to end this evening, is that God has clearly approved of monogamy, clearly discouraged polygamy, and that this actually fits what he's been trying to communicate from the very beginning. Back in Genesis chapter 2 and verse 24, Genesis 2 and verse 24, when you have Adam give his statement, "Now this is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh, she shall be called woman because she was taken out of man." We can't know just from Genesis who says the following line. Is this Adam saying, kind of looking forward to the future, "For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh"? Or is this just Moses years later as he is writing this story down? Or, as I'm going to suggest, it was actually God speaking through Moses. How do we know that? Look at Matthew chapter 19. Matthew chapter 19. Jesus tells us exactly who was stating this in Genesis 2:24. Matthew chapter 19, look at verses 4 and 5. And he answered and said, after they said, is it lawful to divorce for any reason? Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female? So notice that, keep that in mind. God, creator, made them one man, one woman. And said, who said? He who created them from the beginning, male and female. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. Who gave that command? God did. And he did so from the very beginning. Now, I don't know if Adam heard that specific command. It's possible. It could be that God is inspiring Moses so that now that we have kind of fuller revelation, he's saying, now I want you to learn from this story. I gave Adam one woman for this reason. A man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife. But regardless, what we find is that Jesus brings this into the new covenant. And basically what he says is, this was God's pattern from the beginning. This is the way it always was. And this matches the command that I'm giving you. Do not separate. One man, one woman for life. He says that's the way it was in the beginning. Not just by example, but also by divine command. And now what do we see? Every time we come to a marriage in the book of Genesis, it either matches up with that order or it doesn't. And when it doesn't, it always leads to some kind of riot or problem for the people who are involved in it. Now, I've been speaking for a while now, and I'm thankful for your patience, but I do want to spend just a little bit of time answering a common question that comes up from this. If the pattern is monogamy, how could God accept polygamists such as Abraham and David? Those are usually the two examples that I hear. You've got Abraham and you've got David. How could God accept them if they were polygamists? If this is what the pattern was from the beginning, how can God accept these men? And I would just say that context is helpful. Abraham is before the law, Torah, but David is after the law, after Torah. And so it actually gives us kind of a comprehensive picture. And in fact, these two are given as examples of how did God justify them? By their faithfulness to him. And so we have this picture of these are faithful men. How does polygamy fit into their description as faithful men? How can we match this up? Well, I would say that Abraham, who lived before the law, was someone that may not have had the direct command, don't take many wives, or may not have even necessarily heard the original command. And so I think that is a factor to consider. I'm not going to get into a whole discussion of Romans 4 and Romans 5, but where there is no law, there is no condemnation. It seems that God does not hold us accountable for laws that are going to be given in the future. And so it could be that we look at it from that angle. But the other way we could look at it is what we've already discussed in the story of Genesis, is that he seems to learn that polygamy is not God's ideal. And what does he do? He waits until Sarah dies before he takes on another wife. So could we say that Abraham has learned the lesson by experience, this is not what God wanted. And so in that way, he was faithful to whatever commands he was aware of that God had given to him, and was thus faithful to him. What about David? David did have the story of Genesis. He did have a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife. He did have that picture of this is what God intended. Well, I do not necessarily say that I'm going to have the most satisfactory answer to this question. But I will say that we do need to keep in mind that these people are living in different times of revelation, and that God has commanded kings, do not multiply wives to yourselves. What do we see in the story of David? Multiplying wives to himself did not work out very well, did it? And his son learned the lesson so well that he wound up taking many, many, many wives. And how did that go for Solomon? They pulled his heart away, and he became faithful to other gods. When you read the story of David, and especially when he takes Bathsheba to himself in an adulterous polygamous marriage, that is the downfall of David. This is not pictured as David took many wives, and it worked out wonderfully for him. The story itself says this is not good. And I don't know what happened in the life of David. I do know that there were certain things that God permitted, like divorce under the old law, but Jesus is going to pull it all the way back to created order and say this is what it's going to be and this is what it needs to be. But I would say that by the end of David's life, I don't know how much he was involved with the various wives. You see, Bathsheba is kind of the premier wife at that point. And even when he needs a nurse, it specifically says he did not know her. He did not have relations with her. And so by the end of his life, we do have maybe a slight change. But the point I want to make here is that whatever we see in these stories that discourages polygamy is the lesson that is brought forward. And when we have full revelation that says, let not man separate, because from the beginning it was one man, one woman, and therefore that's what it needs to be for life, then we're supposed to learn the story of the entire Bible and not just look at point, and try to prove something we want. It's what does the whole picture tell us? And the whole picture says polygamy is not God's plan. He may have overlooked, permitted, forgiven, but what do we see in the new covenant? We see the full picture that this is what God always intended. One man, one woman for life. And why? That leads us to our final point, is because under the new covenant we can see what this was actually representing. And I would say that's true of the old covenant as well, because God was married to his people. And then specifically in Ephesians chapter 5, he says, I speak a great mystery. This is a great mystery, but I speak of Christ and the church. Under the new covenant, we can see exactly why God started out with monogamy, why he discouraged polygamy, why he even commanded kings not to be involved in polygamy and a large harem. It's because this was representing a spiritual reality of one God and one people. And for those who start to suggest, polygamy is just fine. It may not be for you, but it could be for someone else. They're missing the whole story of the Bible, that this is saying Adam and Eve were meant to picture the greatest husband and wife. And we are looking to get back to, or actually get to what the Garden of Eden was representing, is one husband, one bride at the tree of life. What happens when we abandon that pattern? We do the very same thing that Adam and Eve did. And we are removed from the presence of the tree of life. And the husband that we as a church have longed to see. Is polygamy a big deal? Yes. Because it messes with God's pattern and it tarnishes God's type. Now the question will be not just, will I have no other wives, but will I in my marriage represent Christ and the church? Coming full circle to where we started, I think what we find when we read through the stories of Genesis is something that God can say very simply in a command in the New Testament. And he can show us in a picture of the spiritual reality. But he wants us to be able to read the stories and learn what he was trying to reveal. Yes, at very surface level, he's saying, don't get married to more than one spouse. But that's just the surface. That's not the depth. What this is representing is something far greater. And when we can learn to read the stories of the Bible as part of a bigger story that represents something that is spiritual and eternal, that gives so much more motivation to represent the pattern and the type in a way that honors God. You may be unmarried, and you may be thinking, I know not to marry more than one person. I'm not going to move to a place where I can start adding multiple wives. But what I want to tell you is that in any relationship and in any action, we need to make sure, am I representing Christ and his will well. And it may be that in some way we haven't. We need to repent of that. We need to confess that. But ultimately, I think what we see here in this local congregation of people who are trying to serve the Lord and are trying to show faithfulness to Him, we see a picture of people who are who are that one bride, part of that one church that is looking forward to going home, being brought to our husband. Are you ready to see Him someday? Your one husband who has loved you and laid down his life for you. If you're ready to respond to the Lord in some way, why don't you let us know how we can help as we stand and as we sing.